Welcome back to another episode of the Commander Experience podcast. I am one of your hosts. I'm Brian.
And I'm Jacob. Today we are going to talk about breaking the mana curve. So here we're going through what mana acceleration we're going to use and for what reasons we're going to use that. And also in general, just theory about mana.
Let's break it down. I think a nice place to start this podcast is talking a bit about the general power of having a low mana curve. What advantages do you get from having a low mana curve, and what happens if your mana curve is maybe too high? So, what do you think about that, Jacob?
Yeah, it's definitely no secret that in general, it's probably better to have a lower mana curve. Like one of the very basic reasons is the theory of double spelling. So basically that if you have two spells that cost 3 mana, instead of having one spell that costs 6 mana, you can cast one of those spells early on and you can cast a 6 mana spell. So it kind of makes your deck be able to work in the early turns, and then in the later turns you can double spell and get the same value as you would do from one big spell. So that's like the very basic one.
And of course, sometimes you do get more power from the one spell because the more powerful abilities usually come with a higher mana cost. But then you could argue that having early value in the game may snowball into having a lot of value over many turns. I also think that we can talk about free spells or cheating spells into play. It is why they feel powerful. It's because you're not paying mana for them. So let's talk free counter spells, for instance. The reason they feel powerful is, of course, they're free. They don't take curve into consideration. They don't take into consideration in what part of the game you are. They're good early game. They're good late game. You can always use them, and that's why they're powerful. You don't have to make these considerations when you put them in your deck, how high your curve is. They're always working, and that's why they're powerful. And you also see it on, I do know that you have to pay mana for these effects, but you also see it on Cascade, that the stuff you're casting from the Cascade is just so much value. Like you also said, the double spelling comes into effect here. I do know that these effects, of course, cost more mana in general, but it's just to bring the point home regarding that cheating spells into play or not paying mana for them is the reason they feel strong, is that it's kind of cheating the whole mana curve.
It is also kind of like double spelling because you can play your whatever piece that helps your whole plan, but still have the mana up to interact with your opponents for free. So you can, further your own board state, but still having interaction.
But let's talk about average mana cost. We are playing in Bracket 4, of course, and we mainly do these podcasts surrounding Bracket 4 mentality. So how much do you take average mana cost into consideration when building your deck? Do you think about it at all, or do you think that the powerful cards that comes with Bracket 4 just usually cost less mana and hence they're powerful anyway, and by that extent you don't need to put that much thought into it?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that I would say that when I build my first draft of the deck, mostly I don't think about it. But when I just then look the deck over and see what to cut and maybe what not so good, I have a tendency to just sort by highest mana cost and look at all the highest one. And if I'm in doubt, I just remove the highest ones, unless it's some very specific piece that I need. So it leads to my decks having pretty low mana curve generally.
Do you think, just real quick talking about average mana cost, do you think a well-built deck where you take the mana curve into consideration, many people say that it's powerful to have a 1-drop and 2-drop, a 3-drop, that you're casting spells on every turn. Do you think a well-built deck with a good mana curve is playing more powerful in general?
I think so, yeah. It's based. I think you can see it kind of like if you get mana screwed, it's kind of the same thing where instead of you getting mana screwed, you just can't play a card, so you actually have the mana to do something, but you cannot use the cards you have in hand, so you're kind of mana screwing yourself even though you have the mana. So honestly, it's doing like kind of this. It does have the same issue as mana screw. So I think in general, lower mana curves and more thought out mana curves make the deck more smooth running.
And one of the considerations, of course, is always, or at least it is for me when building a deck, is how much does my commander cost?
Yeah, I think that's a big one. And that's also where a lot of I think especially a lot of the newer commanders have decreased in the mana cost because power creep is happening. And that also increased the value of faster or lower mana cost mana. So Utopia Sprawl or Mox Diamond or stuff like that. I can see at least from my deck choice, and of course my deck choices also reflect our power level, so I have a tendency to pick commanders that have a lower mana cost as well. But I can see that from my point of view that the 1 mana ramp is really beginning to be better and better and better, because I want to have that 3 mana on turn 2.
And it also affects how much ramp you're putting in the deck, of course, because as you said, we have a tendency to run the Moxes and Utopia Sprawl, Wild Growth. We usually play those in decks where our commander is costing 3 CMC, because we want to be able to cast them on turn 2 most of the time. But we also have, of course, the opposite direction where your Itali deck, to use that as an example, you do run a lot of other ramp pieces because you can afford it in that deck, because you know that your commander is coming down much later, and by that extent you can sort of mold your ramp package in a very specific direction. And we also do that with the 2 and 3 CMC, I think, because as we talked about regarding your Glob deck, we talked about how good Nature's Law and 3 Wizards were because they're costing 2 mana, but you also want to cast Glob on turn 2. So if you have 3 Wizards in hand, the point was, are you not going to cast Glob on turn 2 anyway? And if you're not going to cast Nature's Law on 3 Wizards on turn 2 now, how good are they really in your deck if you're not running a land strategy and so forth? So I do think those things come into consideration when you talk mana curve.
Yeah, definitely. And also have, in the example you came up with, also have the thing where, at least for me, I kind of aim for having a specific amount of, let's say I want to have 3 mana on turn 2, I aim to have a specific amount of 1 mana cost ramp in the deck. So maybe that even though that I could play more, maybe I only need 10 or 12, whatever the magic number is here, because I just need that one mana piece, and then kind of the rest doesn't need to hit that mark. So that's also why I sometimes have conflicting ramp, like in the Glob deck.
I also think that running a low CMC commander, you have, or at least I have most of the time, a tendency to run lower ramp pieces, especially if my ramp curve doesn't have a big spike in the mid game. If I have a deck where my average CMC is around 2, I don't need that much ramp. Usually only need ramp to get my commander out on turn 2, and by that extent, I'm usually running a lower count unless there's a reason not to. What do you think about that? Are you also doing that, or do you just run the same amount?
For the most part, I actually run the same amount. I will say Italian stuff is the outlier, but I am pretty much aiming for 50 mana sources. I think where my changes is probably where on the scale they lie. So decks that don't need to have the mana early on, I play more big mana rocks, which kinda makes me have less ramp because I can play them early on. So the decks actually kinda ramps worse in the start, but then in the mid game it can have these big swings. So that's probably more where I vary my decks.
To change the subject a bit, let's talk a bit about mana blocking, or whatever you want to call it, where let's say your commander is costing 3 or 4 CMC. How many cards are you now running in your deck that has the same mana cost? Because as we talked about with Glob and Nature's Law, you will have the same situations where I've played decks myself where I run Smothering Tide, but I'm also running a 4 CMC commander. So now I have Smothering Tide in hand and I have 4 mana available. Do I cast a Smothering Tide now, or do I cast my commander? Depending on the game plan, of course, and most of the time it's just more value to cast your Smothering Tide, but also there can be situations where you may see a window where it's just best to cast your commander. And I do know that the Smothering Tide example is maybe a bit extreme because Smothering Tide is just so powerful. So let's use examples where it's cards with less value than that. How many of those are you running in your deck that is blocking the same CMC as your commander? Is that something you think about when you're building decks?
Yeah, it is interesting because we have had this talk a lot, and I think this is something that you think about a lot, at least. And I will say from my experience, I don't really think about it that much. And sitting here and talking about it again, I think it might stem from the fact that a lot of my commanders are low CMC, and I don't know if it's a right theory or it sounds dumb, but my theory is that basically let's say my commander is Glab, that is 3 mana. My whole deck is now built around, or at least it should be, getting that 3 mana as soon as possible. So on turn through, ideally. Then it's kind of an upside that I have other very powerful 3 mana spells, but because suddenly now I have a choice on my turn 2. And specifically 3 mana as well, and that's something I like to mention, is that 3 mana on turn 2 is kind of this magic number where, let's say I hit the 3 mana on turn 2, and I have two CMC rocks in my hand. I also suddenly have the choice of playing a 2 mana rock and using that 2 mana to play another 2 mana rock, and now I have 6 available mana on turn 3, which is double the amount of the 3 mana. So now I can, and if my whole deck plays 3 mana stuff that is powerful, I can now play 2 of those spells on turn 3. And still have all that mana on the next turn. So I'm not sure if it's correct, but in my brain, I don't think too much about it. And in some sense, I see it as an upside that I have a lot of spells that is the same CMC because my deck is meant or built to cast those spells.
An example I would like to use, one I thought about when I rebuilt my Muldrotha deck. I rebuilt it into a Lands Matter deck, and one of the situations I ran into a lot of the times were the cost difference from Lotus Cobra to Tireless Provisioner. I just found out that getting Lotus Cobra down first because you have the mana to do so, followed up by a Tireless Provisioner. Now you have both of them out, where if they had the same mana cost, you weren't able to do so. You would only have one of them out. There's a big difference for me for having both Lotus Cobra and Tireless Provisioner in hand, or if it's Tireless Provisioner and Nissa in hand. Because those two combinations, even though it's the same result in mana returned, just plays very differently. And I do think it's a nice example to use when talking about mana curve and the power of filling out your curve as you go, and also regarding if you should play cards that have a lot of the same CMC, meaning that if all your cards is free CMC, if you don't have that game where you can cast them turn 2, because you may have mulliganed in a way where you didn't get there with the ramp, so your first free CMC spell is now coming down on turn 3, and now you have this whole other variety of turn 3 spells that is just going to be real difficult for you to cast. I do think a smoother curve solves that issue, that you're not setting yourself up to fail in some games that maybe become a non-game in some cases. And like I talked about with the Cobra, I just do think that your deck plays a lot different if you smooth out the curve a bit. And that's why I'm thinking about it a lot, at least, because it just fills out nicely, I think.
Yeah, in that context, it makes a lot of sense because that's a very high impact of having it 2 and 3 mana because it goes in a row. So I do definitely see it in that context. I'm not sure why I'm not thinking too much about it when building decks. And saying that is kind of wrong because I do it with the ramp at least, because I'm very specific that I need 1 mana ramp if I have a 3 mana commander. So I kind of do have it in mind, but not as much as you probably.
Yeah, and you have it in mind for other parts of the game. And the question, I guess, is should you have it in mind for all aspects of the game? Because I also think there's a point to be made regarding, do you even need the ramp? I know that having access to a lot of mana is powerful, but there's also, I think you asked the question when we went over my Emry deck. It seems that you have access to a lot of mana, but you don't have a lot of spells to use it on. So what are you using all this mana for? And I thought that was a great question, because what are you ramping towards? I do think that's an important question when you're building your ramp package. Are you aiming to cast your commander as soon as possible? Let's say he costs 6 or 7 CMC. Are you aiming to cast him as soon as possible? If yes, then of course you want to put in a lot of ramp in order to obtain the game plan of casting your commander as soon as possible. But if you aim to have him down late, maybe because he's part of the win con, and you want to play him at the last possible second when you're trying to win the game, are you now ramping towards casting your commander? No, you're not. So I do think putting thought into your ramp package and asking yourself, what am I ramping towards? Because let's say again, you have a 6 CMC commander. If all your other spells are 2 CMC, now you're ramping so you're able to cast double spells in a sense. So you're ramping in order for you to cast 2 spells that cost 2 CMC. But you're also using 2 mana to ramp instead of using 2 mana to just cast a 2 CMC spell. So you're kind of delaying the value. And I would like to use Torsten, my Hair Parent deck, for that same reason. I'm almost not running any ramp in that deck, because every 2 CMC I'm using that is not a heir parent is a tempo loss in that deck, I feel. So I do know that is an outlier of sorts on building mana, but I do think it's something people should think more about than they are. How much ramp are you putting in, and what am I even ramping towards? Because I don't think every deck wants to ramp the same amount, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. I will say, when you're talking about it more here, I was in my brain thinking about, okay, if my win con is, let's say, Boulder Citadel, then suddenly my rampage changed a lot. I probably running Dark Rituals and stuff like that give me a big burst in one time, especially because if my rest of my deck is just 2 CMC or below, then suddenly I don't need to have the 6 mana. I need to have it one time and then not anymore. So I have no use for Gilded Lotus and all these big mana rocks. I just play rituals to do it. But if my deck reminds me more of Vitali, where you want to play as my commander on repeat, then you suddenly need to have that repeatable mana, and the rocks is the way forward. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
I actually just built Green Goblin. I haven't played the deck yet, but the reason I'm mentioning this now is that it's the deck where I have the most amount of ramp in the deck. I don't have another deck that have more ramp in that. And the reason I'm mentioning this now is because, like I said, I do think you have to ask yourself that question: what am I ramping towards? But in that deck, I'm not using it so much to ramp as I am playing it for free with the Green Goblin's effect. So all my 2 mana rocks are cast for free when I discard them. And casting 3 mana rocks is a whole nother power level than paying 2 mana for them. So by that extent, I asked myself the question, how much ramp do I want to run? And I was like, if I run all the mana rocks, then I just want to run all of them, I guess, because discarding them and playing them for free is just free mana. So
yeah, and in that deck, it's both ramp and payoff, so that's
exactly.
crazy.
And by that extent, I was just like, I'm not ramping towards anything, but having a lot of mana is never bad, of course. And we can all agree, if you're getting free mana, you would always accept it, and that's the case in this deck. So yeah, I do think you need to think a little bit about it. And I also think if we should mention another deck, one of yours, I was thinking about Sithis, where you play an enchantment strategy. And I could imagine that you're not running a lot of ramp in that deck, but you are, of course, running all the enchantments because it makes sense. They both draws you cards and you're ramping. But I could also imagine that besides those, you're not really running any ramp, if I had to make a guess.
Basically just the 1 mana enchantments and the 0 mana rocks, and that's it.
Yeah,
so
0 mana rocks. Yeah, because you want to get Sithis out turn 1, if possible.
Yeah, so I think it's like 29 lands, 13 rain pieces or something like that. So very low compared to every other deck I run, basically.
You are giving it some thoughts when you're building your deck. You just have to find the correct decks to talk about.
I think my rain package is very targeted. It's just all the other cards around it where I don't think too much about it. I'm not sure why, but the rain package is very targeted to the goal of the deck.
Yeah.
And then all the value around it is just doesn't matter too much. I'm just trying to find the most powerful version of that card. A quick thing I was thinking about when talking about this is basically because when I listen here, it also seemed like maybe there is some flavor to be had in ramp, if you can say it like that, like preference. Because after talking here, I have a feeling that it also has something to do like with our playstyle, where I think, at least when I play against your decks a lot of the time, I feel like I'm on a clock. Like, I know that your deck at some point is a point where I cannot stop it. It just seems like we're working towards you winning. And I think my playstyle and like my answer to this has been that I just need to win before that then. So a lot of my ramp is maybe more explosive to try and win under you, if you can say that. So I think there maybe is some philosophy to ramping, even though that a lot of people is trying to say that there is like, this is the right way of doing it.
We had an whole episode on archetypes, turbo and mid-range. And that is also, I think, is a valid point when you talk about if you're in a meta where there's a lot of mid-range games, maybe you want to go turbo mode instead and ramp even more aggressively and try to win before everyone else. I do think that's a valid strategy. And if your commander can support it, I do think it's one way to go. But then again, you're putting a lot of thought into why you're putting the ramp in. There's a reason for it. So you have, even though you said you didn't put a lot of thought into it, put a lot of thought into it, just maybe more subconsciously.
Yeah, probably.
For other reasons. But I also think we could talk a little bit about card draw, because I do think that card draw is also something that in some way are determining how your curve is, because the more cards you draw, the more options you have. And with a lot of options, it's usually easier to fill out your mana curve, having spells to play on turn 1, turn 2, turn 3, whatever you have.
Yeah, card draw for me goes very hand in hand with the ramp, because that, as we talked about earlier, if you have nothing to ramp into, why are we ramping here? So for me, basically, the more ramp the deck is producing, the more card draw the deck needs to run to try to abuse that ramp. And that's probably also more of a bracket 4 thing, because I think that in lower brackets, the way they solve this issue is, okay, I have a lot of mana, so I play this 10 mana spell. Where in our bracket, I think we are more compelled to, okay, I have a lot of mana, okay, I need to draw lots of cards so I can cast all the spells and just win the game or end the game or get so much value. So for me, it's very important.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that our games end on average on turn 6, 7, maybe more 7 than 6. We definitely have games that are ending turn 3, 4, and 5, but I think on average it's 6, 7, and by that extent we don't have the time to cast 10 mana spells. We have to have a much lower mana curve, and I also think that is kind of proving the point, meaning that when you look at CDH, all of their spells are pretty much free spells or very low mana curve. I do know that mid-range has kind of taken over CDH also, but you're still seeing a more general use of low mana spells, the low mana curve.
Yeah, the decks are much more privy to be ultra focused on tutoring for ending the game, where I think our decks is tutoring for more value to try and outgrind the other decks probably.
Let's move on to card of the episode, a little segment we have in our podcast where we talk about a card that is either on our minds in a positive or negative way, but also usually a card that fits into the podcast's theme. And for this episode, we have chosen the card Planar Genesis. And Planar Genesis reads, it's an instant, it costs a green and a blue, and it says, look at the top 4 cards of your library. You may put a land card from among them onto the battlefield tapped. If you don't, put a card from among them into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. On face value, it pretty much reads a lot of like Growth Spiral, I think. But where do you see this card's advantages and maybe downside when you're comparing it to Growth Spiral?
Yeah, when compared to Growth Spiral, it seems to be mostly upside. Of course, there is the whole part of the land being tapped, so if you're in a deck that wants to play Explore and then Growth Spiral and then this card and then this card, it's better to have like the ball rolling and keep getting the mana back. So you get the card selection and get the instant speed like Growth Spiral, but Explore is sorcery speed. So it's like in between. I think it's one of the better ones.
I think, for me at least, it seems like Growth Spiral, its big advantage compared to Planar Genesis, of course, that the land enters the battlefield untapped, but there's no card selection, you're just drawing a card. So, from my point of view, Growth Spiral is more of an early gameplay, because it's not really doing that much mid to late game. Okay, you're paying 1 mana to cantrip because you're getting the land back, but if you don't have the lands, you're kind of paying 2 mana to just draw a card. Where with Growth Spiral, you have the option to ramp early on, but later in the game, you're also having the option to just have nice card selection, which can be vital in mid to late game in bracket 4. So I do think that Planar Genesis is on average a better card seen over a whole game, where Growth Spiral seems a bit better if you play it early on and not as good as if you play it later in the game, unless of course you're running some sort of land matter strategy or something like that.
Yeah, 100% agree. Like the only thing I had to add is basically that in some ways that Growth Spiral Explore is better the lower your mana curve is, because it's easier to abuse the land being untapped. But I think on a general basis, Planar Genesis is the better card for most decks.
Agree. I think that was all we had to say about the mana curve and the kind of thoughts you can put into building your deck surrounding the mana curve. But do you have any closing thoughts on the subject, Jacob?
No closing thoughts. Maybe just that breaking the mana curve also breaks your bank account.
Yeah. It's usually expensive to break the mana curve.
Exactly.
But I do also think that it's kind of making our point, because why are these cards expensive?
Yeah.
It's because they're very sought after and they're very powerful. So
Yeah.
I do think that in this case, the bank is also kind of proving our point regarding power
Definitely.
level. I would just say that I think it's one of the places I moved my game the most when I'm looking back over the last couple of years, looking more on the mana curve, trying to make sure that I don't have 20 spells that all cost 3 mana. Try to split it out just a little bit. Maybe I should run this 2 mana card here and 4 mana card here, and just trying to take more advantages that the game have different states and you have access to different kinds of value during the game. And I also think that's why we think that Esper Sentinel and Mystic Remora and cards like that are so powerful, because now you have something to do on turn 1, and that power that you have value down on turn 1 is just something that you can't argue with, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
Anyway, if you want to tell us how you're breaking the mana curve, tell us in the comments. You can also join us on our Discord server and chat with us there, ask questions, and come with your inputs on how to break the mana curve, and maybe even tell us some funny stories along the way. Thank you for tuning in, and see you in the next one.
Thanks for watching.